Good morning, everybody. Come on, people. Good morning. Did everybody have a good time so far? I hope lots of you got to celebrate sexual freedom. It's very quiet. God bless you, whoever sneezed. So we're going to start this morning, which is the last day of the summit. But we'll be back next year, don't forget. Right here, August 15th to the 18th. I want to introduce you to some very important people. Everybody in this room is important because if you weren't here, there wouldn't be a summit. Well, there would be, but it would be very empty. But these are people who work all year long to bring you the summit. So I want to start with the Board of Directors of Woodhull. If you would stand, please. I want to thank our 2018 partner, Sister Song. We partner every year with a different group or community to bring even greater diversity of issues, of presenters, of passions into the summit. We were so honored this year to be able to partner with Monica and Sister Song. Monica, would you just stand for one moment? Thank you. So Woodhull Freedom Foundation versus the United States of America, right? We are going to be collecting stories of people who have been impacted by this hideous piece of legislation. You'll hear more about that in emails. I just want to let you know. So when you hear a story, try to remember. One of the co-plaintiffs on the lawsuit is here in the room. Would you stand? I lied. They're not. Yes, yes. It takes an amazing amount of courage to participate in a lawsuit like this. We are so proud to be the lead plaintiff and to be partnered with organizations like SWAP and with the Human Rights Watch and with the Internet Archives. For those of you who weren't in the panel yesterday, which was at 4:30 on the lawsuit, the assertion of the government is that what happens on the internet is not speech. Not sure what it is, they didn't tell us, but they really believe it's not speech. Free speech on the internet has to be a reality moving forward. That's what we're suing for. Okay, I'm going to embarrass some people now. Our phenomenal AV and tech team. Chad, would you stand? Rick. Christiana, please stand. Vince. Is Vince in the room? Vince is working. Thank you so much for making my voice as loud as it is. I know some of you are not happy about that. I want to thank again Louis Shackleton, our amazing official summit photographer. Love you too. Joined by Erica. Is Erica in the room? No? Somebody tell her about the love. I want to thank the hotel staff. This staff has been amazing. Jeff and his entire workforce have been down here. Every time I've come down, they've been here. And I said to Jeff, do you go home to sleep? And he said, no, I get a couple hours upstairs. These are some dedicated people, and not just the people you see. The people who clean your rooms every day, the people who serve your food, who set up the tables. Once again, please, for the staff of the Hilton. Thank you. I want to thank our Accessibility Committee. Some of them are here in the room right now. They work all year long with us on things like our website, on the information we provide, how we provide it. This year they came early. They walked the space with us. They made suggestions, which we implemented. Very important to us. Would you, if you're able, stand? If not, just raise your hands, please. Accessibility Committee. Volunteers. Please stand, all the volunteers in the room. It takes an amazing amount of work and organization to make something look easy. Our volunteers accomplished that. This was an amazing year, wonderful year. I am grateful. We are all grateful. Presenters. Raise your hand if you're a presenter, please. Thank you for your time, for your knowledge, for your wisdom, for your energy. There wouldn't be a summit if there weren't presenters. It would just be me running my mouth. Thank you, on behalf of everybody, that it's not just me running my mouth. The Blog Squad. Any members of the Blog Squad in the room? Okay. Let me see, the team captains. So the way the volunteers are organized, there are 4 team captains who work with Mandy. We'll get to Mandy later so we can really make her blush. The 4 team captains are Kenton. Please, Kenton. Lauren. Hannah and Chris. Remember yesterday I said 2 volunteers met here and got married? That would be Hannah and Chris. I want to thank Hansi. Please stand up. Hansi is my assistant. We work together all year long. She puts up with my occasional temper tantrums. Again, I keep saying, you wouldn't have what you have if it wasn't for these people. And Hansi is one of those people. Going right on up. Ted Bernhardt, please stand. Ted always says he makes the trains run on time. Other people say they think he has the taser to keep me calm. Both are true. Elizabeth Wood, please stand. Elizabeth is the senior strategist for Woodhull. What that means in reality is that almost every day Elizabeth is on the phone with me, running the ideas to ground, throwing out some of my ideas. A frequently heard phrase is, shiny new toy. we could not be the organization we are without people like Elizabeth, Ted, the board. And for last, she's already blushing. The entire summit, from the minute we hit the ground here, rests on a very capable set of shoulders. Mandy Farses, summit coordinator. If I didn't tell you that it goes on all year, let me tell you now. All year long, from the minute we leave here until you come back next year, Mandy and I are working on the summit. Right? Right. Do you feel embarrassed yet? I think everybody should applaud everybody one more time, please. Now I'm going to ask the panelists for this morning to please make their way to the stage while I sing to you. I have two fundraising ploys. One is a threat to take my clothes off if you don't donate, and the other is a threat to sing. I'm not going to put anybody through anything today. Awkward pause filled by people walking. Here, Rick. Now, the word on the microphones is you have to be very close to them. You can take them off their stands. Okay. Okay. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Did that come through a microphone? Now. My level's low. Sounds like my oil is running out.
You're working on it.
Okay. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm not going to introduce these people. I'm just going to leave you to guess. No, I've asked them each to tell you about themselves. This panel, Sexual Freedom in the Age of Trump, or the Apocalypse, whichever title appeals to you, we thought this was a fitting way to close the summit, not with the despair that so frequently accompanies the things that are going on, but rather with hope and inspiration and concrete things that everyone can do to move us toward a future where sexual freedom is a fundamental human right. So I'm going to begin on my far left with David Horowitz.
Well, thank you, Ricky. Thanks everybody for having me. I'm the executive director of an organization called Media Coalition. We do First Amendment work. We defend the right to produce and distribute First Amendment protected speech and the right for listeners, readers, viewers, and players to access that material. So what does that mean? It means we do both legislative advocacy, lobbying, and legal work, both to attempt to stop legislation that we believe would censor speech, and then, if it's enacted, to bring lawsuit to challenge it. I've been doing this a long time. A lot of the work does focus on sexual speech. That's for two reasons. One is the morality police are always concerned about what sexual material people are consuming, but also because sexual speech in particular can be regulated by the government to some extent. So there is room for regulation, whereas other types of speech, violence, for example, in the media, the Supreme Court has said is not an area that can be regulated, so there's really very little attempt to do so, although it's not entirely, not something that's not done ever. But anyway, so a lot of that work is on sexual speech, and we've been doing it. It started with the obscenity ruling in 1973 in Miller and the Meese Commission and 2257 regulations and the Pornography Victims Compensation Act. and CDA and COPA, which is where attempts to regulate sexual speech on the internet, and it continues today. So we have our hands full, but I mean, what I find at least encouraging is that we've been pretty successful, and I think it's evident in the amount of material that you can access now, and it sort of has steadily become more acceptable or less ability by the government to regulate this material. So, so that's the work we do. Is that enough of an introduction, I guess?
That was lovely.
Okay, thank you.
And you came in under time.
Well, counting that all, that's my goal every time.
Oriako.
Good morning, y'all. My name is Oriako Njaku, and I am co-founder and executive director of Access Reproductive Care Southeast. We're a reproductive justice organization that's based in Atlanta, Georgia, and we work in 6 different states in the South. So we work in Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Tennessee. And the work that we do, what we do is we provide funding and logistical support to ensure that Southerners have access to safe and compassionate reproductive health care, which includes abortion. And we believe that through our, we believe that through the work that we, closer? Oh, okay, word, yeah. Could do that. We believe that through the work that we do, we can definitely build power, especially in communities in the South, to build power within communities in the South and to really amplify the voices of folks directly impacted by reproductive oppression every day. And so a majority of our work that we do looks like we have a direct service aspect of the work where folks can call our health line Monday through Friday and get funding for their abortion. They can also get logistical support, which looks like rides, lodging, childcare, gas cards, doulas, whatever it is that folks need to access the care that they need. That's where we step up to really support folks in our community. That's the quick and dirty of that. It's really beautiful work too. So
Thank you. Sam.
Hi.
Hi.
Good morning. My name is Sam Ames. I'm the executive director of Trans Lifeline, a suicide prevention organization combining a crisis hotline with a microgrants organization in an attempt to really address the multifaceted world in which suicide, and particularly in the trans community, exists. I'm also the hello. Closer. Sure.
I think that was heard a lot this weekend. Closer.
Dude, I'm trying to talk about suicide
Oh,
here.
I'm so sorry. So back to suicide.
Back to suicide. I'm also the founder of the Born Perfect campaign, a campaign to end conversion therapy on LGBTQ youth, and sometimes a student at Harvard Divinity School, which is a strange combination of things. I'm going to talk a lot about numbers, and so I'm not going to get into them quite yet. But
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Preston.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. All right. Just making sure we're all here together. So my name is Preston Mitchum. I'm the International Policy Analyst for Advocates for Youth. Advocates for Youth is an organization dedicated to championing policies and programming related to young people's access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. So for me, I do some of the boring legal analysis, which obviously is helpful occasionally, but I also do a lot of policy analysis and mobilization for young people who are mostly in the global South, but also within our 140 youth activist network at Advocates for Youth. If you haven't heard of Advocates for Youth or would like to know a little bit more information, we have about 8 youth councils, some of which are our Young Women of Color Leadership Council. We have a new council now called ECHO, Engaging Communities in HIV Organizing, which is our first youth activist cohort of all people living with HIV under the age of 24 years old. We have our Muslim Youth Leadership Council, our International Youth Leadership Council, several others, right? So the purpose of these councils, though, are to build out their platforms, be it on college campuses, be it in their communities. We do have five states that we usually work with that we call our target areas. Usually our target areas are because, conservatives live there and they kind of suck with sexual and reproductive health and rights. So we figure out ways to work with and against them. And so for us, generally what that looks like, well, excuse me, for my portfolio, what that looks like is anything related to SRHR, abortion access, contraception, comprehensive sex ed, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, family planning services, and a lot have been also sex work, decriminalization work, and HIV decriminalization work. So I'm really excited to be here. I'm happy to really talk about the ways in which we can kind of collaborate and mobilize with people on the ground, and also figure out ways we can work both on social media platforms and in real life experiences outside of that social media platforms. And pardon me if I don't really get to the hope aspect until after I vent a lot, right? Because I'm still angry, and I'm consistently angry at the results of the election, what's happening sometimes with midterms occurring. I promise I will get to the hope eventually, because we do need to get there. But right now I'm wavering between this place of rage and hope, and I'm somewhere around the middle today.
Rage and hope.
You can be both.
Yes.
Often.
Yes, you can be both.
That's
You know,
actually how I work best. So
So speaking of rage and hope, I just realized that I forgot to, sorry, recognize our 2018 Vicky Sexual Freedom Award recipients. Speaking of rage and hope, Carrie Bettinger Lopez and Mia Mingus. Mia, raise your hand. And you thought suicide and the joke was bad. Okay, so rage and hope. I think we've all experienced both many times since that day that shall remain nameless, probably. But where do you find hope consistently? We had a conversation, actually, Sam and I had a conversation. Yeah, it was you. About how the calls to the suicide hotline go down when there's an action that people can take, when they feel like they have personal agency and ability to create change. That's what we're going to talk about now. So, David, on our call,
Yes.
You shared about the challenges of legislation, like a bill like FOSTA that says, oh yeah, no, this is going to end human trafficking forever, and what people can do where there's legislation to actually help defeat what's going on. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, Ricky, thanks. What we were talking about on the call is the importance of the narrative. As Ricky was saying,
Closer to the mic.
sorry, better. In this, the discussion of what eventually became FOSTA, which I will call FOSTA, despite others dissenting, it had been going on for about 2 years, maybe longer. And the whole discussion was about sex trafficking, when in fact the legislation was much broader and was not in any way necessarily limited to stopping sex trafficking. It was stopping really almost any discussion of sex work online. And let me stop for a second. I don't know if everybody knows, FOSTA, right now there's a law called Section 230. It basically allows platforms to be immunized. So if you search for something on Google, Google's not responsible for whatever comes up, essentially. So it allows platforms to provide much greater information by not making them liable for whatever it may be. I mean, sex trafficking or prostitution would be one example, but whether it's defamation, libel, all kinds of otherwise acts that are otherwise, or speech that's otherwise punishable, the platform itself can't be punished. So this was the first attempt to roll back those protections, particularly for what they call any speech that facilitates sex work. And the notion is that this will be used somehow to stop sex trafficking. And that was really the problem. The narrative was all about sex trafficking, and it's a very difficult narrative to overcome. We see it in states on other kind of legislation. We also see any legislation that deals with sex work is under sort of the rubric now of trafficking, regulations of adult clubs or strip clubs, all put under the rubric of sex trafficking. Any regulation, we are doing this to stop sex trafficking, and it becomes much more difficult to change the debate, change the narrative. So having advocates and having people willing to step up and be plaintiffs, obviously, in a case is important. But before you get to that point, having the voices of people who are doing this kind of work, being able to say, that's not me. This is going to make my life more dangerous, put me at greater risk. Having those stories as part of the public discussion is really essential. And we did not do a very good job of identifying people and informing people to stand up and say those things publicly to try to attempt to change the debate and really change the narrative. So in that respect, having voices of individuals who are in the milieu that's being the legislation addresses is really helpful. So that's something that people can do on a regular basis, be willing to stand up. And at times it's difficult, and at times it can mean being criticized or being singled out. But it's really essential to be able to change how legislation is discussed.
If people wanted to follow legislation or be more aware earlier in the process that there's potentially devastating legislation coming down the pike, where might they go for that information?
There's a number of organizations that follow this to some extent. I mean, pardon me. I can't say there's one place that would have everything that anybody in this room might be interested in. There's a number of groups that follow legislation that we work with. We're one, but we have a specific focus. EFF, Center for Democracy and Technology, Emma was on the panel yesterday. ACLU to some extent. But again, there's not sort of one clearinghouse, and I think it would be very difficult given the wide breadth of interest of everybody in this room. Different kind of legislation that impacts people differently. And I think that's part of what we failed at, is not being able to get enough press discussion to raise the profile of the legislation generally, to allow people who might just pick up on this sort of activity through the news, as opposed to sort of following a specific group. I know a number of the groups groups that I mentioned were talking about this legislation, posting on it, but finding some way to it might not be an organization that you follow regularly, so you don't know to go because this particular bill is up, and that's where trying to get some news coverage and really having the stories to get news coverage is kind of a catch-22. I mean, one of the plaintiffs in the case is a massage therapist who was doing non-sexual massage therapy, advertised on Craigslist, had a nice business that is now cannot place an ad on Craigslist and is permanently sort of chased around, and the ads are taken down. To have had that story in this discussion, to be able to have had a statement during the legislative process would have been hugely helpful, but how to find that person is a challenge. A challenge for us, and a challenge for the people in those circumstances to know who to turn to. So still have to work on that, I think.
One of the things to think about when you're thinking about legislation is that often when we see a bill, we think it came out of nowhere. The work behind SESTA FOSTA and ultimately FOSTA has been going on for 10 years?
Oh, probably. I mean, certainly, well, two things. I mean, first of all, certainly sort of the notions of trying to stop online advertisements for sex work has been going on for at least 10 years.
Yeah.
And that then sort of turned into, the attempts to do so at the state level and in civil courts was routinely blocked because you had Section 230, and that's when they turned to Congress because they needed this exemption. So this is the first time Section 230 has been amended to allow some material to be prosecuted under state law, and also allow for civil suits against the publishers of the material. And that's why you see, like, for Craigslist, for example, didn't just take down the sex works ads, but they took down all the dating ads. And other websites are doing taking similar actions. So yes, it's been going on for a long time. And to be fair, a lot of it is things you'll read, stories, it'll be sympathetic. You have, there were several lawsuits, minors who had been have been engaging in prostitution, not voluntarily, who are suing Backpage.com in civil court seeking damages because they believe they facilitated. You know, that's a pretty powerful story, and and it's something I think even those of us here would all be sympathetic to the plight of those kids. So understanding that would then metastasize into rolling back these protections for the internet generally and for sex work generally is something you don't necessarily recognize when you first see this case and think, oh, that's too bad those kids can't get some recovery based on what happened to them. So, you know, that's the difficult part of it as well, is to say, you know, is when to say, oh, that's an unfortunate story, which then turns into a 10 alarm. There's going to be legislation that's much broader and has an impact that will be felt by many in the room.
Thank you.
Sure.
Oriaku. Organizing in the South.
Yes.
Unique experience. I once asked somebody at a meeting when we were talking about what would happen if someone was elected to office. We have those conversations. And the answer was, it isn't going to matter to us because we don't expect anything from any administration. Our problems are the same no matter who is in office.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, doing this work in the South, I mean, especially around abortion access, is a doozy, y'all. Like, I'm sure you can imagine, like, the complexities around accessing care. Just accessing basic human rights in the South has been something that is, you know, that folks have been fighting for decades. And, yeah, I feel like I'm one of those, you know, like, when we were talking about being in the middle of, like, rage and hope, I feel like I'm this, like, awkwardly optimistic person who's always like, I have hope, we can win, we will change, you know? And it's almost like I have to have that mindset to be able to, like, really mobilize and rally folks that we're in community with. Being able to have this idea of, you know, even if it's like radical hope, you know, which is in direct opposition to like the stories and the opposition that we face every single day. When we're talking and thinking about abortion access, you know, once Roe became legal in 1973, it made abortion legal, but not necessarily accessible. And so we've been dealing with access issues for the longest time. One thing that I'm definitely doing, that we do, you know, at ARC Southeast, is we're able to make these connections between, you know, the work that we do around abortion and, you know, a bunch of other issues that impact the lives of folks that we work with every single day. And that is part of taking this, you know, intersectional approach to the work that we do. What that looks like is, you know, hearing and thinking about like Sesta Fosta and making the connections between abortion funds and how this is another attack by politicians on our ability to like make decisions that we feel like are best for ourselves. They're attacking our ability to, you know, have autonomy and live our best lives in the same way. This is also another attack on our, you know, on our bodies. Thinking about, you know, when you mentioned like the work that you do in the Global South, recently we had this like Bold Black Futures event where we brought folks from the Global South and the South together to have conversations around abortion access. And it was so beautiful because we were able to see those connections and be like, we go through these same things, maybe in different ways. We have these reproductive justice issues. Maybe folks are not calling it reproductive justice, but it is. And so I think part of this, like having hope, even in spite of like all of the oppression that we're dealing with, is being able to like, you know, have these conversations, create these like safer and braver spaces for people to like really be in community and start talking with each other. I think ultimately being able to create those spaces will create this cultural shift, not only around how we address abortion, but how we address healthcare, how we address, you know, just being able to access the basic material needs that we need to live and thrive. And there are lots of opportunities, I feel like. I mean, you know, the election for us was like, welcome y'all. Like, we've been going through these shenanigans for a long time, so yes. And, you know, when we think about like Kennedy announcing, you know, that he's retiring, I was like, I mean, what has he really done for us, y'all? Like, yes, yes, it sucks, but what has he done for us? So, it's being able to be in this like really unique space to think about like what is actually possible. Being able to approach this work with a lot of love, making sure that we want to streamline processes for folks to be able to access care is something that we do. There's a lot of like power of like being able to make, like I said, these like cross-movement collaborations with folks. So as we're wanting to like expand our practical support volunteer network, which is the folks, you know, on the ground who are able to provide the rides and lodging and childcare, really challenging folks in these really amazing ways to be like, how far in this moment are you willing to go to push yourselves to really support folks in our communities? And what does that actually mean? Does that mean that, you know, you're going to be able to leverage your privilege in some way, shape, or form to really support folks on the ground? Does that mean you're going to order and stockpile Plan B and be able to transport that to people? Does it mean that you're going to talk to your local herbalist and be like, my friend, do you know how to do things outside of, you know, the normal healing practices that you do? It's just like really challenging and like looking at ourselves to think like, how far are we really willing to go? To support people in our communities. And so that's one thing that I'm really challenging our volunteers to think about, challenging people who are wanting to get into this movement to be like, well, yeah, this is the time to really do all the radical stuff that you've wanted to do. Because one thing that I've seen for sure is with the Trump election and how bold and ridiculous the antics that they do every day are, I'm like, why are we not as bold? Like, why are we not being as radical? This is not the time to be afraid. This is the time to take a little risk and know that there are people and lawyers and, you know, some folks out there will support us in doing those things. So definitely challenging people to be like, don't be afraid. This is the time, y'all. Like, this is the time to really show out.
So there's stories, there's sharing stories, there's conversations, there are things like stockpiling Plan B and getting it down into the South, blankets, opening homes to people who are coming down to do the work on the ground, coming down into the South.
Yeah.
Just calling an organization and saying, what do y'all need? What can I do? Even from here. You don't have to be in the same city or state.
Right.
Right? So Sam.
Hi, Ricky.
Hi, Sam. You're on.
I'm just on.
You're so on.
Just go? Okay.
Go.
No, sure. I can do that.
But start with the apocalypse.
I was going to get there.
Okay.
So Ricky called me. Yeah, there's a build up to the apocalypse.
Yeah, all right.
Ricky called me a couple months ago and asked me to do this and told me in really no uncertain terms that I had to leave people with hope. And I was like, Ricky, I literally talk about suicide all day long. That is all I do. And it's relevant, right? The call volume went up so significantly after Trump was elected, more significantly by 5 times than even general suicide hotlines went up. This had an impact on trans lives that is measurable, as do many law and policy changes. We see it reflected every time there is an announcement of SESTA or FOSTA or the military ban or something. We see our call volume go up. We see that people are actively suicidal and we are losing real lives. And I'm really into numbers. I could talk about those numbers all day, but the ones that I actually want to talk about are these 10 kids. The morning after Trump was elected, we woke up and these parent groups of trans children had tracked 10 children lost to suicide the night of the election. And we're not getting those kids back, right? We know that. But yesterday, Mia Mingus, who is somewhere in this room, being brilliant back there, hi Mia, sort of warned us against this narrative of resistance, told us that what we need is more builders. It's not just about what we've lost, and we can focus on what we've lost because grief is real, and I think that's actually going to be the point of this talk today. But that it's our responsibility to build a world that the next 10 kids can survive in, right? So I said, Ricky, instead, can I talk about the apocalypse? And she said, yes. I don't know why, but she's letting me talk about the apocalypse.
I always say yes.
You always say yes. That's helpful. Does anybody know what the literal Greek definition of the word apocalypse is? Are you all nerds like me? Yeah, somebody raised their hand. Revelation. It is an uncovering of what was always there. It is not an end, much less an end of the world. It is an uncovering of the way that the world has always been. So what we know, what Oriaku just was referencing, is that incidents of police violence haven't gone up since the invention of the cell phone camera, and incidences of sexual assault haven't gone up since the creation of the Me Too hashtag. And as hard as it is, the embeddedness of white supremacist ideology in American values has not become any more deeply entrenched since the election of Trump. These things were always true, and the people most endangered by those things have been saying so for literally hundreds of years, and they have not been listened to, and what we have now is an apocalypse. But I want to emphasize the word "an." I don't know the plural of apocalypse. Are there any Buffy fans out there? Did we ever sort that out? It's the plural of apocalypse. Apocalypse. Great.
Yeah.
Totally obvious. Thank you for being more of a Joss Whedon nerd than even me, which is hard. The Sunday after the election, this badass Lutheran tattooed queer pastor named Nadia Bolz-Weber preached this sermon about the apocalypse, and I'm absolutely stealing some of these ideas from her. And what she said was that originally apocalyptic literature didn't exist to scare the bejesus out of children so they would be good boys and girls, I'm quoting here, but to proclaim a big hope-filled idea that dominant powers are not ultimate powers. Empires fall, tyrants fade, systems die. God is still around. Substitute whatever you need to substitute for God. I study religion, it's a thing. I tend to say God or whatever God is shorthand for, but whatever floats your boat. And I think that it's relevant, actually, to bring some language of spirit into this conversation. And I'm going to warn you that I'm going to use a little religious language, but I promise not to proselytize. I don't think there is a single evangelical Unitarian Universalist out there, and that is my tradition. But as uncomfortable as that can be, I think that the people in this room might be better situated than most to make some meaning out of what's going on this level. I was at a workshop this week. I've been splitting my time between this and the Philadelphia Trans Wellness Conference, which has been some driving. And this discussion emerged about trauma and why queer and trans people seem to have so much of it. And PTSD occurs at these hugely high rates in queer and trans communities, even when you take into account that we are uniquely victimized by violence. And we know that not every act of trauma turns into PTSD. We're not quite sure why, but I'm going to make a weird choice here and tell you my therapist's theory. She thinks that queer and especially trans people have to spend so much time working on introspection and deep reflection to even get to a point where we can trust that what we know of our bodies and our souls is true against all the world's evidence to the contrary, that we dig up parts of the human experience that are actually universal, but uncommonly discussed. And it ends up being a lot of feelings. I think we all know that in this room too. But if that's true, what a gift this room is to the world, right? At the height of the AIDS epidemic, Tony Kushner called HIV the virus of prophecy. And on the days I believe in prophets, which is like give or take 50-50, I tend to think he's one of our good ones. Taking the baggage of like capital R religion off for a minute, as much as we ever can do that, I think a lot of people in this room know that embodiment, that skin and sex and sensation can be a religious experience. Finding authenticity in that, right? Finding authenticity in our own flesh is the spiritual journey of a life, not only for queer people and not only for trans people and not only for kinky people, but for anyone with a body. And some of us just kind of have a little less choice in whether we embark on that journey. And the path forward, this hope, I think, is that it tugs a little more insistently at some people than others. And I genuinely believe that those with the least embodied privilege, who are being tugged most hard by that path forward, who experience issues of racism and colorism and ableism and sexism and cissexism in a less escapable way by virtue of that flesh, can lead through that path more clearly. And on the days I do believe in prophets, I think they are ours. We are steeped in this culture of supremacy and domination, and we are also rooted in the scripture of American writers like Octavia Butler, who says God is change. God, or whatever God is shorthand for, isn't something that controls us, but something that we shape with our own hands. And that change is uncomfortable, and what we're seeing right now is how uncomfortable America is with capital C change. I think that's pretty clear. We, and I absolutely include me in this, don't like discomfort. We'll do anything to avoid it. We like concrete deliverables. We like action steps. We don't like sitting in the complicated emotions of being called out on our own nasty habits and biases and complicity in oppression. We do not like it. But in this age of Trump, in which we are discussing sexual freedom, we have to discuss our own complicity, right? I think that actually Trump is an opportunity to teach us as much about ourselves as about America. So Ricky asked me to leave you with two things, with hope and with action, and I'm utterly screwing up both. And she hasn't strangled me yet, so I'm going to keep talking. How am I doing on time?
I have too many witnesses.
You also, I think, have 3 lawyers at this table.
Yes, well, there is that too.
I don't think hope is useless. I just am not sure it's the right question to be asking right now. I think it relieves some of our anxiety, and we need to be sitting in that anxiety. I used to work on a psych unit in San Francisco where a lot of queer and trans folks end up as patients. And we talk about suicide a lot, right? This is what I do. I talk about suicide. And the thing that I know about talking about suicide is that you can't actually address the problem until you talk about the thing you don't want to talk about, until you get uncomfortable. I was in this panel in a room full of lawyers last week, and rooms full of lawyers are terrible. Try to avoid them. But somebody asked Elizabeth Gill over at the ACLU how to stop the fact that we are about to lose in the courts like so much, and we are. And in this really uncommon move for a lawyer, she sat with it for a second, and she said, I think we might need... And it was really uncomfortable for the lawyers in the room. We are trained to have exactly 2 sides and to fight the anonymously evil person on the other side of the table. But it was this really powerful moment that if we are going to build, if we are going to be these builders, we have to grieve. We have to sit with our grief. We have to admit that we have lost big, and also that we have lost big before, that we come from generations of fighters and of builders. After the election, Alicia Garza, one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, came out and trying to make sense of this, was the first to remind us that the people who the path tugs on harder are by definition the ones that institutions have never protected, who have never relied on institutions to protect us. I come from the LGBT civil rights world where we have been relying on the courts to protect us from the inequality derived from the rights attached to marriage for a long time. And we won that, and we got very excited. And for a second, we thought maybe we could rely on an institution to protect us. And it was something that looked a lot different if you were white and turned out not to be entirely true to begin with, right? For those most marginalized, not just by this election, but for longer than anyone who is still shocked by this election can imagine, this is what we've known for a long time. Not living on hope, but living past hope, which is something I absolutely stole from Tony Kushner. In Angels in America, I'm going to nerd out about Angels in America for a second. I also have a theater background. Can I not? Do you want me not to? Am I done?
Go ahead, take
okay.
a minute. That was one.
That was one? I have 1 minute? Okay. There's this protagonist, and he's this gay white man living with AIDS at the height of the epidemic. And the story revolves around God abandoning Earth and a bunch of angels trying to avoid the pain of that by telling human beings to stop moving and stop fucking and stop building. And he rejects that prophecy. And he still demands a blessing that has nothing to do with hope. And he asks for this. He says, I lived through such terrible times, and there are people who live through much worse, but you see them living anyway. When they're more spirit than body, more sores than skin, when they're burned and in agony, when flies lay eggs in the corners of the eyes of their children, they live. Death usually has to take life away. I don't know if that's just the animal. I don't know if it's not braver to die, but I recognize the habit, the addiction to being alive. So we live past hope. If I can find hope anywhere, that's it. That's the best I can do. It's so much not enough. It's so inadequate. But still, bless me anyway. I want more life. So my action plan for you isn't to donate, though please donate. And it's not to volunteer, though we really, really need volunteers. It's to sit in the anxiety of not being able to do anything. It's to grieve for a minute. And to know that surrender isn't about defeat. It's about transformation. I think probably the people in this room, or at least half of us, know that better than most. Surrender's not defeat, right? It's this beautiful moment. And action steps alleviate some anxiety, but only temporarily. Sexual freedom in this age of Trump is uncomfortable, but we have been called to make our spaces safer for the people he endangers for a lot longer than the term of a presidency. And for me, living past hope in this age of Trump means looking to the prophets who make us uncomfortable, to prophets of color and prophets living with disability and prophets who are undocumented and sex workers and femmes and trans and queer and kinky and ostracized, who tell us that it isn't just America that is racist and colorist and ableist and sexist and cis-sexist, but this very room we are sitting in today and us. It is us, and that's uncomfortable. But God doesn't just shape us, we shape God. And America doesn't just shape us, we shape America. So if we're going to build a world that those next 10 kids can survive, we're going to need a lot of the things that we don't want to talk about. We're going to have to get comfortable with discomfort. And I was having one of those uncomfortable talks last night with Andy Eisenson, and he reminded me that defeat is not destruction, that we struggle and we fight and we lose and we survive. And we struggle and we fight and we lose and we survive. And it's not just a global cycle, it's a personal one. And it's how we build if we let it build us. And it means we're still alive and still part of this cycle. And the apocalypse is not the end of the world, and we don't get off that easy.
Thank you.
Oh, right, and I think there's hope in that.
When you're a moderator and you sit down next to somebody with 6 pages of very, very tiny typed notes, you know you're going to have an issue.
I love you too, Ricky.
I love you. So, Preston, I don't believe that we can exist any longer in this country without recognizing what's happening in other countries and how we impact other countries and how other countries impact us. Hope and rage.
Yeah. So thank you for that very leading question. So for me, I kind of want to take a moment to kind of sit with the 2016 election and kind of some of the work that activists and advocates were doing in preparation. I think we kind of sold ourselves short very early. I mean, to be honest, in the spaces I was in, at least, everyone was planning for a Clinton election, Clinton victory. And I think that lack of foresightedness, of anything else, of really not realizing just how racist America was, or just how imperialist or colonialistic America has always been, or sexist or transphobic, we kind of sat with our friends, air quotes, and we kind of envisioned this, again, hopeful world with only one person being president. And then we saw this apocalyptic moment, the moment that took shape that many of us as a black queer man from the hood knew was always real. And so for me, as someone who always talked to folks about be willing to understand that our victory may not be what we want it to be, we never were really ready for it. Some people were, some people being those who are already kind of situated within those marginalized identities, kind of started to prepare. But also, to your point earlier, and something I really loved was this idea of really understanding that some people, no matter who's in office, lives are not going to be changed for the better. And that's just a real moment that people are very uncomfortable with sitting with. I was talking to, and I will get to your point, I promise. I was talking to some black trans women in Southeast DC about elections and about voting. This was a couple of years ago. And one of the things that was very consistent in the conversation was no matter who's here, no matter who we are electing into office, I'm still going to lose access to services. I'm still not going to be able to walk down the street and feel protected. People are still going to say names and misgender me, and I'm still going to be susceptible to violence on the streets, both by police and by people on the street. And so it kind of made me really think about like just how we operate with one another and how many people were frustrated with the idea of them not voting because they said my life won't get better, right? So it turned into this conversation of civic engagement and what voting looks like. I think we have to be honest. For many of us who believe that voting changes problems, it is because we already come in with the privilege aspect that voting actually is the only way toward freedom. For many people who have been discriminated against every day, voting is maybe one box to help people toward freedom, but it's not the box that's really going to get us toward that liberation, at least my liberation, right? So I want to just kind of center all of that in the conversation, because when we think about our identities, when we think about what blackness means or what anti-blackness looks like in this country, which obviously has spilled over into other countries, when we think about like the intersections of reproductive justice and disability justice, when we think about the ways trans communities are treated and folks who experience suicide ideations are treated, we realize we've always been here. Unfortunately, people are just now starting to listen. It reminds me of something that one of my mentors told me about abortion access when it came in the 70s and the 80s, about how a lot of it was always women of color, especially black women-led movements. And then a lot of white women started to understand that they were being attacked too. And because they were realizing they were being attacked too, they wanted to kind of leech on their sisters in the struggle, right? Meanwhile, pushing those same sisters behind them in the struggle. So I want to your point, Sam, leave us with that discomfort, right? Considering the audience that I'm speaking to, right? I can see the audience that I'm speaking to is majority white, and I really want us to kind of sit with the discomfort sometimes from a black person saying we need to get better with our shit, right? It's tough, right? But we have to do the work. So to your question, America has been fucking up countries for a long time. And I will say now, it's always interesting talking. I just came from the International AIDS Conference last week, and it was interesting talking to folks who were like, oh, you're from America. I'm like, yeah. And they're like, oh. And it was this awkward silence. And I'm like, I get it. But rest assured, I am not that problem. That problem. I may have other issues, but that man is not my issue. At least in the way that some of them are viewing it. But what it really made me think about was just how dangerous America has been for other countries and for people living in other countries. I think about things, particularly since I work in U.S. foreign policy, think about something that many of you may be familiar with, the global gag rule. Think about how the global gag rule was enacted within 24 to 72 hours after the inauguration happened. And not only was it enacted, it was, the presidential memoranda, it was expanded to the biggest it's ever been, even since the iteration originally from Reagan. And so it expanded to all global health assistance, right? So if you are a provider in Kenya working in a clinic, you can't even use your own funding just by way of you signing a contract with USAID or the State Department. And so when you think about just how messed up that is, when you really think about the fact that a policy person is telling people what they can do with their own money, not our money, their own non-U.S. money, just by virtue of saying, I can refer someone for abortions or want to discuss abortions, that's really screwed up. And it's going in the exact opposite of how countries are going with abortion access. Abortion laws across the world are being liberalized. And so when we think about exactly how many states are passing these laws, like limiting access to information and services, limiting comprehensive sex ed, limiting birth control, when we think about just here a couple of months ago with rollback of Title X protections, like we are going exactly in the opposite direction of most other countries. And so that's on one angle. When we think about also just really how America is really losing its leadership in the world, and I put a pin in that because from my view, America has really never been that much of a leader as we think we are in the world. We just happen to have a lot of money and white supremacy that makes us have unfettered discretion to screw people over. But we, quite frankly, have never really been seen as a leader. We've seen as someone with a pocketbook. And so when we think about things like AB-only funding and how we're actually going back to AB-only funding, which is now being reframed as sexual risk avoidance, which whatever the hell that means, like to actually avoiding risky sex is somehow, it's just AB-only by a different name, right? It's still funding streams that go into abstinence-only programming and services, but it's the same thing. So if you see sexual risk avoidance as a language, just know it's abstinence-only. And that's what happens when you have an administration. Even things like the global gag rule now is called protecting life in global health assistance, which is interesting when you consider that when you limit access to abortions, what you're actually doing is increasing the rates of maternal mortality and unsafe abortions. So, in case you really want to have an interesting Thanksgiving conversation, just know that if someone says that they are against abortions because they're interested in saving lives, just know they're doing the opposite. And we have data. Data will matter again. We have data to back that up. Someday. So what I really want is just kind of contextualize some of the conversations we're obviously having, but really just connecting it to sexual freedom and Trump. Trans discriminations that are happening obviously in military and in schools, ICE raids and deportations that are happening, family separations, lack of continuum of care from this administration for people living with HIV. We just, on Friday, there was an introduction of a PEPFAR reauthorization bill by some interesting bedfellows, right? But it's status quo. It's not anything that's been expanded. It's just taking 2018 away and putting 2023 on it. So we can have, yes, the same amount of money leading up into 2023, but it still doesn't really save the lives of the people we really need to be caring about on the ground. Sex workers' rights obviously being curtailed by way of FOSTA, police accountability or lack thereof in things from the Department of Justice and our good old racist in chief, Jeff Sessions. So when we really think about all of these things, what are we doing? How are we pushing back? What's really happening? Young people will save the world. Mm-hmm. Young people will absolutely be the saving grace. And I think that's the thing we have to really think critically about. The other day on social media, so in the black community, one of the things that I always grew up hearing is, and this may not be true to just black people, but it's certainly my experience, is that the quote, children should be seen and not heard. And it's something that used to piss me off from like a young age. And I've heard many parents still say it to their children. And these are some of the same people who say young people are just so amazing and will change the world. And I'm just like, you can't have it both ways. You cannot tell young people to be silent and just actually be there and not listen to them, then somehow say they're magically going to change the world. And so, for me and working at Advocates for Youth and really seeing young people between 14 to 24 really actually actively working against these policies such as Stop Kavanaugh. I don't know if you all heard of this man named Brett Kavanaugh. But he's nominated to be the next Supreme Court justice, and there's a lot happening, obviously, within that right now. But young people immediately mobilize and, are actually actively working to talk to members of Congress to make sure that people vote no, to either block a vote or delay a vote. And that's something that I haven't seen from many other folks, right? Young people were emailing us and saying, what can we do about this? We know this is a bad thing. What can we do? We know this person will limit access to, SRHR services. We know this is someone who really doesn't care about black and brown folks, immigrant communities. What can we do? And this is some of the ways they've started to galvanize. So on August 20th, Advocates for Youth and other partners such as National Women's Law Center we'll be having abortion storytellers to come on the Hill and actually talking about why Roe is at risk if we actually nominate and appoint Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court seat. Something that's also critical when we think about the Global South, Global North, and connections are the International AIDS Conference. For those of you who may not be aware, the International AIDS Conference in 2020 is in the Bay Area. In the 1980s, it was illegal for people living with HIV to actually ingress into the United States. And so because of a lot of activism, and that was supposed to be in Boston, the International AIDS Conference then. A lot of activism occurred, and it was pushed out of Boston and moved to Amsterdam. And it was actually in Amsterdam just last week. So a lot of people are actually attempting to push AIDS 2020 out of the United States. Why? Well, we have things like Muslim ban that are actually happening, have been codified by the Supreme Court. We have many people who actually will not be able to have visas processed. We have people who may have people who have their visas processed and enter into the country and may not be able to go back out of the country. We have many sex workers who cannot come into the country. And so the point of this is these are all marginalized communities, otherwise public health term key populations, who are at highest risk of acquiring HIV. And they will probably be unable to participate in International AIDS Conference in 2020. So if you see a lot of activism happening, so that's one version of activism happening, people attempting to push, like you cannot have an AIDS 2020 for all with Trump in office, right? Like spoiler alert, things were not perfect under the Obama administration. right? We still had siloed of sex worker communities in AIDS 2012 when it was in Washington, D.C. However, one of the things that we still notice is it's still a very different climate, right? It's still more vitriolic now, and so we have to kind of resist, asterisk, as much as possible. And on the note of resistance, I've always gotten so kind of a little, frankly, tired of the word resistance and kind of, Preston, you're so resilient. I'm like, I don't want to be resilient.
Yes.
I actually just want to get up, drink a mimosa, and just live my life, right? Like, that is really what I want to do. It just so happens that I'm a queer black man and I have to live my life differently at times, but I don't want to be resilient anymore, right? People who have experienced these privileges when they walk down the street don't have to worry about resilience, right? Because you're seen as naturally being resilient. Resilience to me is such it's a cop-out, right? It's a way so this is how marginalized communities could act and should act. And if they acted this way, things would be better. I don't want to be resilient. And so, don't excuse my language, but fuck resilience. I don't think people need to be resilient. People need to be able to survive and thrive. And those are very different things. And so the last things I'll kind of leave off with is the progressive community. Okay. So I will say, this is probably the first time I've said this publicly because I can't even believe I had these thoughts in my head, but it's true, is that if there was a small silver lining to a Trump win, I almost vomited. So if there is a small silver lining to a Trump win, it is that progressive communities had to start infighting more than ever before to figure out that we were not perfect.
Yep.
So with a Clinton victory, the one thing that I've consistently said is that things would have been status quo. I know it probably doesn't seem like that for many people, but things would have been pretty much the same. It would have been hard to push to this like newer arc of at least, again, how I see liberation happening. But with Trump happening, it made people who ordinarily would probably agree realize that we have these hierarchies of oppression happening and that people were attempting to say that my oppression is a little bit worse than yours. Your ouch does not hurt as much as my ouch does. And so I say this to say also during the AIDS conference, one of the things that I noticed about this like intra-progressive conversation, there was an article in the New York Times, very shitty article in my opinion, in the New York Times, that was essentially attempting to argue that progressive people are more restricting of each other than conservative people are. And the way the conversation happened, and the way the article actually kind of thematically was written, was sections, but one of the sections essentially talked about freedom of speech and how we're becoming too sensitive to comments and statements. And, and one of the things was, it was kind of leading off with, I was at a party and I made a joke and all these progressives got offended by my joke. And I'm like, well, because it was transphobic, it wasn't a joke. You made a really harmful statement. And I'm sorry that you felt your speech was being impacted, but people literally get killed because of your statement. So no one should be laughing at that. And for some folks, for him at least, he was offended because it felt like we should have been together, right? Because at least he's not conservative. And, if you haven't figured out by now, I said a couple more words, but I think we have to it's just really kind of leading off with this conversation of really being with the discomfort. Because if we're not actually being with the discomfort, then we're also following that status quo. And so, progressive communities have to get comfortable with being wrong. Mm-hmm. We have to understand that it is okay if we are wrong, right? Because that is what progressivism for me all about. It's about creating a world that we have yet to see. It is about being visionary, right? It is about actually sitting with our discomfort and realizing that we are not working on this for ourselves, but for communities and generations to come. And so I just don't think we're there yet, but I do honestly think that was a silver lining for Trump to win, because I don't think we would have been having these tough conversations of what does it look like to say you're an ally. But actually, I kind of get frustrated with that term. For me, it's like upstander or co-conspirator, because allyship is very passive. Allyship doesn't require much but saying, I agree, snap, snap, which is cute. Please keep snapping if you would like. However, being an upstander and being a co-conspirator means actually being in the dirt with someone. not letting someone who you're saying you're in allyship with take the brunt of being the person to speak up, not being burdened by something racist or sexist or transphobic happening, not relying on the person who's experiencing the greatest harm to always have to fight for themselves. And those are very active differences, and I don't think the progressive community have got there quite yet, and I think that's true, honestly, in the global south and in developed countries.
Thank you. You know, facial recognition on a phone doesn't work when you're being subtle, because you have to pick it up so it can see your face and tell you where you are on the time. We do have time for a couple of questions from the audience. I know there's someone with a microphone. Someone? Isn't there? See what I don't know? If you have a question for any of the panelists, please raise your hand, and someone will come to you with a microphone.
Thank you, Ricky, as always, for convening such an amazing table of intellect and action and kick your butt into gear. This is actually more of a comment that's not about politics. Should we be donating our lanyards into a box or a bag for next year when we go out of here? The lanyards? Sorry, I texted you and you didn't answer.
Well, I was busy. Okay, so does anybody have a comment or a question for the panel? Can you picture our board meetings? Seriously. Way at the back of the room, there's a question. Thank you, David.
My question is that I didn't hear a lot of talk about disability liberation, and disability rights movements. So I'm wondering, how are all of you showing up for disability rights activist communities now, and how do you intend to in the future?
Thank you so much. Are we taking stacks or is that?
Are we
taking stacks or is that? Should I just respond to that question?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the question. So a couple of months ago, the Center for American Progress and Planned Parenthood convened pretty much a disability justice and reproductive justice roundtable. So it's not yet a consistent working group, but it is a roundtable that was started to really kind of see the cross-sections between both disability justice and reproductive justice movements, and really discuss how we can work better together. And so Advocates for Youth has been a part of that conversation. So right now it's just mostly been resource sharing. However, at Advocates for Youth, we do have documentation, both through what's called our Amaze initiative, which is an initiative focused on using short animated videos to teach very young adolescents about sex. And so we do work with, frankly, Gallaudet and actually dubbing some of those videos and actually creating both captions for those videos and actually making it so that it fits multiple communication modules. And we also have a sex education guide for parents with disabilities and for educators who teach students with disabilities. So there are some things we're working on, and I would be interested to really talk afterward to see if there's any other collaborations that can happen.
Thank you. Anybody else want to?
Yeah, totally.
I thought that's why you were writing.
I'm a note taker, okay?
I know.
Quit making fun of me. So thank you for that question, and thank you for lifting up ableism in this room right now. I think that in a discussion of disability rights, what I want to make sure we're doing is contributing in ways that feel useful from our position, and the way that feels useful from the position of a suicide prevention organization is in incorporating mental health into the disability justice conversation. So there was just recently, a couple weeks ago actually, a law passed through Congress and actually signed. We actually got a good piece of legislation signed under this administration. That should be hopeful. Called the Suicide Prevention Hotline Improvement Act of 2018. And it does a couple of things. It gives some money for research into particularly impacted communities, especially veterans. It gives some policy study in the future, but it also allows us to partner with the Department of Health and Human Services and SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to talk about a policy that Trans Lifeline has had since its inception that is really controversial in these communities. We have a policy against non-consensual active rescue, which means that because of the particular relationship that trans people have with the police, we know that calling police on somebody whose only reason for having the police called on them or having services called on them is that they are suicidal is a risk factor for suicide. So what we're doing is we're having conversations with HHS, with SAMHSA, and with suicide prevention community more broadly about particularly impacted communities, specifically around policing and how mental health interacts with policing in order to create particular kinds of vulnerability and how we can be addressing that as a suicide prevention community. So we're doing a little bit of that.
Thank you.
When it comes to the work that we do at ARC Southeast around, abortion access, I will say we're 3 years old, and so there is a lot of work that can be done to, make the work that we do a bit more inclusive. Some things that we do, though, is whenever on our hotline any, disability concerns are brought up, we definitely advocate for those callers by calling the clinic to make sure that they're aware of, anything that might pop up. If there are certain things where we know a clinic that someone is going to may not have a ramp or may have stairs that you have to walk up, then we have suggestions for other clinics people can go to. We're also going through some rebranding as well to make our website just, be more accessible as well. So there are definitely things that us and other funds can do. And, also welcome, additional conversations about what can be helpful as well.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
It's bingo time.
Yes, there's a question up here. No, somebody should get to you with a microphone. Thank you for waiting.
Yeah, no problem. My question, can people hear me? Is this good? Okay. My question is for Aryaku. I wanted to see if you could talk a little more about access, because I feel, even with the conversation about the potential of Roe v. Wade getting overturned, is not talked about from a reproductive justice standpoint. It's kind of like the right, and not talking about access, especially in the South.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that, thinking about Roe v. Wade, but also thinking about access, and particularly in Southern states.
Right. So when I think about access, there's so many barriers to access that just go beyond the funding piece. So, as an abortion fund, one of the main things that we do is funding abortions. So that is one huge barrier to access, is just the financial aspect of that. In the 6 states that we work in, every state has different laws associated to accessing care. So there could be waiting periods in some states where, I believe in Tennessee, there's a 48-hour waiting period. In some instances, that ends up turning into a 2-week waiting period based on the clinic availability and, the provider availability as well. There are all sorts of TRAP laws, which is targeted regulation against abortion providers. And they come up with the most ridiculous things to try to block people from even accessing clinics, such as, the blade of grass in your yard needs to be 1/8 of an inch or whatever, which of course that definitely has an influence on you being able to have it doesn't have any impact on you being able to have an abortion or not. But there's all sorts of things like that. There's transportation. Folks are crossing state lines every day to access an abortion. With ARC Southeast, the 6 states that we work in, 95% of callers live in a county that doesn't have an abortion provider. So not only are people crossing county lines, they're also crossing state lines every day to access care. barriers such as shame and stigma come into play as well. So, people being afraid to have these like courageous conversations with their family members, with, their loved one, with their partner, to even let them know, like, I'm considering having an abortion. That is also an additional barrier. So being able to call us and talk to a volunteer who, is unapologetically, for their decision, is something that is, one way to eliminate that barrier as well. The time, the laws, the waiting periods, the gestational limits in states, one day there was a caller that we were working with who was going to Mississippi, which there's only one clinic in the state of Mississippi. And she went into the clinic and she was about 13 weeks. But the provider wasn't going to be available for another 2 weeks. And by that time, she was going to be past the gestational limit to be seen in the state of Mississippi. So then she started to try to figure out how to get to Atlanta to have her abortion. So it's things like that where it's like the logistics around getting, am I taking a bus? Am I taking a plane ticket? Or am I getting a plane ticket? Where am I going to stay? Who am I going to stay with? Who's driving with me? I mean, there's so many barriers to just accessing care in addition to like the laws that are in place that make it really difficult. But again, I'm that awkwardly optimistic person who's like, okay, then that's where we need to step up to, eliminate barriers to access and make abortion more accessible. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
First, I want to sincerely thank everybody on the stage for everything that they're doing and their perspectives and their insight and their encouragement, because I'm super motivated right now.
Thank you.
And I know that within this space that to some degree I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, but I'm going to say it anyway for the folks that might be watching this via live stream right now. When it comes to standing up for sex workers, showing up for sex workers, I think that this is something that is of the utmost importance. And when legislation is being passed that panders to people's fear or maybe conflates consensual sex work with human trafficking, it's really helpful when you can set those people straight. And so if you're involved in a conversation and people are talking about these laws that are being passed, these laws that have already been passed that are hurting sex workers and endangering their lives, it's really helpful just to say something about it. And at the same time, centering the voices of sex workers of color, differently abled sex workers, trans sex workers. And I'm going to echo what David was saying earlier about how important it is for us to share our stories, but at the same time recognizing that some people can't be out as a sex worker. So if there are folks that have been affected by SESTA FOSTA, maybe we can brainstorm on a way to share experiences in a way that could be anonymous, but still collecting those experiences because they're vast and I hear them every day.
Thank you.
Can I comment on that?
Sure.
I definitely feel like, when I mention like the cross-movement collaborations, that there's opportunities to look towards other movements and groups who have been doing some really beautiful work around storytelling. The first example that I think of is the National Network of Abortion Funds and their We Testify program. It's such a beautiful program, and I don't know if there are any We Testify folks in here, but yeah, it's such a beautiful program that's out there where they've created this space not only, when we're asking folks to really start sharing their stories, it is our responsibility as well to make sure that we're also protecting them in sharing those stories too. So, when we're thinking about like ethical storytelling and what does that look like, and if we're inviting folks, who are coming from marginalized communities or coming from, environments where they can't really fully be out, like what protections do we actually have in place to really support them? So does that mean that, like, I remember there was a time that we were doing an article with like Marie Claire, and before it was out, I was like, are we going to make sure that like I'm okay? Like if the antis come for us, like, are our folks okay? So going through this process of like scrubbing information online, making sure that if there's like Google alerts that pop up where, you know, my name ends up being there, like making sure that we're protected, is something that is super important as far as like storytelling too. So I would just suggest that like look to other models with storytellers to really make sure that, you know, we are creating an environment where storytellers do feel like they are protected, and their stories are being honored, and they feel safe in doing so as well.
Thank you.
I've got one too. You gonna yell at me if I go?
Go ahead.
Great. So I'm a big nerd about numbers, and when I came into this job, we started doing some data collection, and we started looking back at past call rates and how they're being affected by policy. We're in this moment right now where, like, in the progressive liberal movements, it can be sort of politically advantageous to call yourself an ally to the LGBTQI community. Mostly the LG community, a little less with the B and the T, Q and the I, we don't know what to do with. But there is this moment in which it is more politically doable to align yourself with trans folks and sex workers. So I was doing a little number crunching last week, and I was looking at how our call rate was impacted by various pieces of legislation. And there are ones that you would expect, right? When the trans military ban was announced, our call volume in the next week went up 45%. That's enormous, right? That's huge. When SESTA was passed, it doubled. It doubled. You actually cannot be a trans ally without being an ally to sex workers. Mm-hmm.
It's the smile. I think there were two more questions that I saw.
Preston, I love what you were saying about allyship versus being an accomplice, being a co-conspirator, and also thank you and thank Advocates for Youth for really showing up in the fight against SESTA, both before and after. So thank you. I was hoping you could say, and anyone on the panel could say a little bit about being able to do that really hard co-conspirator work, and also being really thoughtful to the way that space is taken up and different stories. You know, what is that relationship, and how do you navigate that? That
is the age-old question. I was literally on a panel 2 days ago talking about this because I don't know if there's an honest answer. I think there are genuine people who do the best they can do in navigating that, but I'm not sure if there's, a silver bullet there. So one, thank you for your work, and really thank you for so the reason I really want to bring up even that, and to your point earlier, I'm sorry I didn't get your name, is, Advocates for Youth, we have a 1 in 3 campaign, and our entire campaign started as an abortion storytelling project to demystify abortion, to destigmatize what abortion looks like, and who actually receives abortions, who can receive abortions. And to the part about what being anonymous looks like when you're actually reporting or actually discussing things, because you shouldn't have to out yourself to actually have your stories validated and be seen as valuable. And so we're working with, we have worked with the Sex Workers Advocates Coalition to actually build out, we actually helped to get the decrim bill introduced in DC City Council. We'll be one of the first cities to actually fully decriminalize sex work in DC, fingers crossed. So working hard on that. And also we just, with the help of Black Youth Project 100 and a couple other organizations, we just launched decrimnow.org. So please feel free to go to it. And that's also going to be used to catapult, hopefully getting decrim bill pulled out of committee. It's so difficult, to be honest, to kind of, particularly me as someone who's not, I always say this, abortion is not a women's issue, it's a reproductive capacity issue. And so as someone who is a cis man, I'm always in these interesting positions and seats because I'm usually the only man in rooms when it comes to sexual and reproductive health and rights work. And even if I see another man in the room, we're usually gay, and it's like, hey sis, how you doing? And so it's always very interesting to obviously see who's showing up in the room and who's not showing up in the room. So for me, I kind of had to learn this notion of what it means to kind of actually speak up and sometimes shut up, depending on how I see the burden flowing for certain people. So if I see, if for me, this is a very I statement. So if I see that there's something happening with trans folks, with black women, and I see and I see a silence happening, maybe because it's just an exhaustion of defending your identities, I'll more than likely just kind of speak up immediately. I'll check in with them first, honestly, and then kind of speak up when I feel that it's safer for me to speak up more than them. And then it's about navigating spaces. To be honest with you, one time we were blocking the intersections for Black Lives Matter a couple of years ago, and it was this presumably cis-het black man attacking a more masculine of center woman, and not physically attacking her, but certainly on the way to do it. And, so I intervened. That man, y'all probably would have whooped my ass. But I didn't care in that moment, right? Because for me, being an upstander and a co-conspirator means that I, as someone who considers myself an upstander and a co-conspirator with black women, need to intervene. And so that intervention could have led to violence, and I recognize that in that moment, and it should not have led to that, or even the thought should not have led to that. But for me, just the idea of being a co-conspirator means that I need to kind of experience this harm more than you are in this moment, because your entire existence is always experiencing harm. So I think these are just difficult conversations, honestly, because I don't think there is a right answer because you also don't want to be the person to continuously speak up, because then you are doing a disservice, and then you're actually just serving a mouthpiece and not doing the work of an ally, of a co-conspirator, because you're just centering yourself within that conversation. So I don't know if there's a true answer to that, other than be very cognizant of who's in the room, of how much space you're taking up. Sometimes that means literally listening to the number of times other people speak, really actually being cognizant of how many times you speak. But I will say that is a lifelong process of realizing when you're centering yourself and how to actively decenter yourself from conversations, which is really difficult if we are in a particular part of our own identities that are used to being centered.
Thank you. There was a question up here.
Yes.
Thank you. This is the last question, by the way.
Hello. Okay.
So make it good.
Hi. It's kind of a two-part question. First of all, thank you. One would be, what do each of you, if you wish us could know anything, people could know anything about your field and the work that you do, what would it be? And for people like me who desperately want to get more involved, what is something very specific I can do today or this week?
Well, I'm glad I'm just moderating. Let's start with you, David.
Thanks, Rick.
Oh, sorry.
Something.
Lean into the mic.
No, I'm thinking out loud.
Oh.
Something I'd want you to specifically know about what we do. I do need a minute to think about
Okay.
this, so give me a second.
Okay.
Somebody else wants to jump in first?
Yeah, it's a juicy question. Thank you. I was like, yeah, juicy, zesty.
This is like stump the panel.
I know. Well, one thing I guess I would want you and other folks to know is that we're going to win. Like for sure, we're going to win. I'm confident in that. And that, there's something that folks say is like we can only move at the speed of trust. And so in order to do that, just really start being in community with each other and know that in order for us to win, we really do have to start trusting each other and talking to each other and creating spaces like this to really challenge each other in really beautiful ways. Want folks to know that we're all about dismantling systems that were never created for us to thrive in the first place. But in dismantling it, it does not need to be chaotic. So there definitely needs to be strategy in, getting to that win as well. I like to tell folks who we talk to that ARC Southeast, we have this motto that we do our work with ratchet and rigor. And so we like to unapologetically bring ourselves to this space every day, but also also are really rigorous with the way that we do our work. So that is something I would want folks to know about our work. Something that you could do immediately outside of making a donation to your local abortion fund is checking in with those folks too, to be like, what is it that I can actually do to help? We like to think of our volunteers not from like, this is what we need you to do, but it's like, what is your skill set and what do you think that you can be able to like bring into this movement as well? We all are experts in something. And if there's something that you've identified where you're like, you know, for instance, we have someone who's like, a huge introvert, but is like this dope ass graphic designer. And she's like, I can't give people rides. It's just like not my thing, but I can do some graphic design work, you know? So like identify those things that like you're brilliant and bomb at and, you know, offer those things up to the movement. That's something that I would say that you could easily do. Yeah.
All right. Sorry. I guess one thing I would say, I mean, I am, in what I do, in work on free speech, things are largely status quo, but improving. In the sense, it's not seeing whatever's going to happen, you know, whatever has happened and will happen with the current president. There's a greater alignment on questions of free speech, First Amendment protections, probably politically than there's been since I've been doing what I do. The conservatives have also kind of picked up on the notion that free speech is an important right. It is, you know, in some ways, that many would not agree with on questions like campaign finance or questions about corporate speech, issues like that. But there's much less of what's been the traditional split, which is that those on the left who are much more protective of free speech and those on the right who are much more inclined. And in my view, in many ways, a lot of the battles that the right fought, they lost. Sexual speech is obviously much more readily available than it was. So a lot of the efforts to censor based on morality, and particularly morality around sexual speech, is a victory that, you know, the case law is that there's now much greater protection, and the avenues of distribution, particularly with the internet, that anybody can access the information without having to go to a store, without having to show their face to buy a magazine or get a video cassette. So the stigma, so the issue of stigma is not what it used to be. So those things, in that respect, there's strong reason for optimism. And certainly, you know, there's a debate on the left now, in fact, that the optimism should be pessimism because the right of the First Amendment protections are used in a way not to promote justice, but in a way to sort of inhibit it. So recognizing that debate is going on as well. But anyway, so in that respect, that's something about, you know, sort of what we work on, in that, you know, we don't. Justice Kavanaugh might be bad on a lot of things, and I don't doubt that he will be if he's confirmed on a lot of issues we talked about today. On speech, probably much less likely. And in fact, some ways that he'll be good on First Amendment are ways that a lot of people here would disagree with. So, so that's some of what we work on is a little different, or maybe is a lot different than the issues everybody else on the panel works on. But there's at least cause for, or not reason to have pessimism about sort of the current environment in that respect. The flip side, of course, is the attacks on legitimacy of the press. And I wish I had an answer for how to respond to that. You know, the breaking down of the legitimacy of the press as an institution, the notion of there being actual truth is very troubling, and it's not something that we deal with organizationally because we really work within kind of the notions of the parameters of the First Amendment. This is much more of a legitimacy question. But I don't really have an answer in how to address that other than elections come and there needs to be some negative consequences to those who try to delegitimize the press, and that's the thing it can do most immediately. It's a couple months away, but elections are a great place to start.
There's something else you can do around legislation, and David spoke about it earlier, and that is watch what's coming. Look at the websites. Take the time to go in, aclu.org, EFF.org.
Who else did you say?
MediaCoalition.org.
MediaCoalition.org.
Yeah, and yeah,
Of course,
that's
MediaCoalition.org.
maybe I should start with that. But yeah,
Yes.
that's it's certainly to be aware and the ability to be responsive. I would say, at least for on legislation right now, things are relatively quiet. Most state legislatures, for example, have gone home, and Congress doesn't seem capable of really doing anything besides passing FOSTA. So there's nothing I would say is pending or is urgent, but these campaigns will come back, and many of them are very sub rosa. An example of something we worked on a lot this year is what was called the Human Trafficking Prevention Act. Now, you might think that actually would be about preventing human trafficking, when in fact it wasn't. It was about requiring any manufacturer, distributor, or seller of any device that allowed access to the internet would be required to place filtering software on the device, and the filtering software would have to be activated. And to deactivate the software, you would have to take proof of age to the manufacturer, seller, distributor, it was unclear, have them explain to you about the harms of accessing sexually explicit material on the internet, and paying a $20 tax to have the software removed. So this was something that didn't get a lot of attention, but there was 22 bills introduced in 18 states. It was something we managed to work on. That part of what we do is if we can kill something without raising alarms, we do that. And sometimes it helps to kill something by not raising an alarm and making it a public discussion, because legislators may know this is a terrible idea and will kill it, but if it becomes a more public discussion, I can't vote against it. But the guy who's behind the campaign, I think, will try to push to have that, to bring the legislation back next year. And this was in blue states, in red states. So there's really not a lot of rhyme or reason, but it's being ready, and that's the problem. At some point, in some state, it will no longer be able to be something you can kill by talking sense in a back hall, but then becomes the public discussion, and that's when we need help from people to say, hey, wait a minute, this is really just censoring the internet. This has nothing to do with human trafficking.
Thank you. Preston.
So on a couple of things you can do. So one, you can absolutely feel free to donate to Advocates for Youth.
Listen, don't forget Woodhull, too.
Well, and absolutely. My apologies.
Spread the wealth.
Right.
Yes.
Our youth activists are working so hard. It's about 140 of them within their councils, working hard to really build out their campaigns, whatever work they're doing actually in community, on their college campuses, outside of their college campuses. So that's really helpful. Even though Congress is Congress, I still think there's something to be said about active efforts in calling members of Congress, at least to annoy and agitate. Because it can slow down a process. I am not a fan of shifting what our win looks like, right? I don't think we should dilute our win to accommodate to the current political environment at all. But I do think a lot of the reframing that we are doing is right now in terms of slowing down processes. And I do think that calling members of Congress, being active, we obviously have midterms coming up. The elections will be here for 2020 before we know it. And so I do think it's definitely a really good time to become more civically engaged if that's something you're interested in. And then the thing I will lastly leave off with is working on ways to build relationships that are long-term and sustainable and non-transactional. Yeah. Doing youth advocacy work, we see so many things where people invite young people to the table just for them to be there and not actually use their voice, use their experiences, because for them, they're young. They don't have a lot of experience, without even realizing that young people, like all of us, are the experts of their own experiences. And so I think to that end, it's really important that we start to build these long-term relationships that are not tokenizing, that are accountable, that are long-term, and that are sustainable. And I think only then can I personally think that I have hope to see this future that's really looking like something that's equitable, that's just, and something that's liberatory.
Thank you.
I wish I had these numbers in front of me, so I'm just going to make some generalizations, but these numbers exist. I'm going to talk about capitalism for a minute. I'm not sorry. What I can tell you is that there is an enormous correlation between suicidality within the trans community and access to services and institutions that should be a matter of human rights. access to health care, access to gender changes on identity documents, access to things that shouldn't be a question but are, that shouldn't be an issue of money but are. Trans rights, if there is anything that you leave here with today, it's that trans rights are an economic justice issue, and suicide is an economic justice issue, and sexual freedom is an economic justice issue. So, action steps. If you would like to temporarily alleviate some discomfort, I can help you with that. If you're cis, we have, as part of Trans Lifeline, a microgrants program that takes small grants and distributes them to trans people who are facing inequalities that lead directly to suicide, gender identity change documents, housing instability, those kinds of things that we know correlate. We cannot just be treating these problems at the point of crisis. We cannot just be treating Trump's America at the point of crisis. We have to be intervening earlier. So if you are cis, I encourage you to donate to that microgrants fund, because the redistribution of wealth is how our communities take care of one another and have for millennia. And if you're trans or gender nonconforming, please volunteer, or sit and have a snack or a cookie. That's fine. You get to do what you want. If you're in crisis, and it seems like that might not be true of this room, but I guarantee you that's incorrect, call us. We are going to be in this fight for a long time. Some days surviving is enough. And for the days when it isn't, we're going to need you. But for today, survive. Call. Thank you. It's Trans Lifeline. If you donate to Trans Lifeline, a portion goes into our microgrants fund. Also donate to Woodhull and Advocates for Youth and all of these lovely people.
So I want to take just a moment before we bring the summit to a close to recognize two people whose generosity and dedication to Woodhull and to sexual freedom help us bring you the summit. Greg and Marla from Enjoy Toys, would you stand up, please? Thank you. I also want to thank our two interpreters who have been amazing this entire weekend. I want to thank our panelists who have been all I could have wished for. And that's what I want to leave you all with. What can you do? You can dream. You can imagine. You can envision a future that looks like you want it to look. And you can think about what we have to do to get from here to there. I encourage you all to look beyond your block, where you are and what touches you, and think about where what touches you touches someone else, and extend a hand to that person, and then another hand to that person. Thank you all. This ends the 2018 summit. It doesn't?
It does not. It does not.
There's always a voice in my head.
Sometimes it's not even in your head.
Sometimes, I know. Sorry. I forgot.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yes, certainly now.
Okay. So before Ricky ends the 2018 summit,
oh my gosh, look
the
at
gracious Nina, the beautiful Nina, and I want to close out the bingo thing. Remember the bingo thing? Yes? Okay.
I just heard two. Oh yes.
We promised there would be some prizes. And we have, 8 of them? 8 of them.
Yes.
So what we're going to do is if you crossed out all 24 boxes, we gave you a free one. If you crossed out all 24, step up front so that we can give you a prize. Somebody?
All right.
Hey! This one. person? There's nobody else that did the whole 24? All right. Who did 23?
This is going to be a long process.
Who did 22?
Did anybody bring their card with them today?
Did anybody?
If you brought your
20?
card with you, raise your hand.
20? That's it?
Okay.
And you get a prize, and you get a prize. 15? He gets a prize. Is there another 15?
You lost your phone.
Okay, here's another 15.
There's another 15. All right. We're going to give all these away. What we're giving away, by the way, is $100 gift certificates from Comfort Zone.
Thank you, Nikki here.
For the first 5 winners, we have one more. 12? Oh! What?
Rick will trust you.
You've got 12 over here, too. I think.
You got a 12 somewhere else? Yes, come up.
Yes.
Come up. You got 14. Hey, give that to her. No, I'm kidding. All right, we have 2 more. 12, 14, 13, 10, 8. Come on. Y'all, I could have filled out 4 or 5 of those categories for you. You should have asked me. Another 8, 10? Last one.
Here it is.
That's fine. You give it to her. Okay. Thank you very much for doing bingo. Keep talking to people about your families. We love you. Bye.